Ethan Cole had always been the quiet type, the one who observed more than he spoke. At 21, he carried a quiet confidence, but there was something about the way people watched him that made him self-conscious. That day, as he stepped into the classroom, he noticed the usual buzz of students settling in, chatting, and packing their bags. Most of them left as the lecture ended, filing out one by one until the room finally emptied, leaving only him and Marissa Davenport, the teacher whose presence seemed to linger long after everyone else was gone. Marissa was in her mid-30s, graceful and poised, with an elegance that seemed effortless. Ethan had seen her every day for months, yet today something felt different. Perhaps it was the way she leaned slightly on the desk, her eyes tracking him as he moved toward his seat. He caught her gaze once and quickly looked away, feeling a flutter of nerves he didn't entirely understand. There was a weight to her stare, a mixture of curiosity and something unspoken, that made the air feel charged. The room smelled faintly of chalk dust and coffee, a familiar scent that somehow felt intimate now that they were alone. Marissa cleared her throat softly, a subtle sound that made Ethan's pulse quicken. "Ethan, could you stay for a moment?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that seemed almost personal. He hesitated, glancing toward the door, and then nodded, moving to the front of the classroom. He wasn't sure why he did it. Some unspoken force seemed to guide him forward. As he approached, Marissa gestured toward the empty chair near her desk. "Sit," she said simply. He obeyed, noticing the slight tremor in his own hands as he adjusted himself on the hard wooden seat. They were close enough now that he could see the faintest details, the curve of her smile when she noticed his unease, the way her fingers absent-mindedly drummed on the edge of the desk. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it made his heart race. For a few moments, they said nothing. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, rather, it seemed to stretch deliberately, a kind of quiet tension that made every small movement feel amplified. Ethan caught himself glancing at her hand, then quickly looked away, feeling the sudden awkwardness of noticing something so ordinary yet oddly intimate. Marissa's eyes followed him, and for a split second, it seemed as though she could see into his thoughts. It was unnerving and exhilarating all at once. "Ethan," she began, her tone soft, "I wanted to talk about your recent assignments. You've been doing well, but there's room for improvement in some areas." Her voice was professional, yet there was a warmth to it that felt personal. He nodded, unsure whether to feel flattered or embarrassed. They spoke about essays and presentations, critiques and suggestions, but beneath the surface, the conversation carried an undercurrent of something else, an unspoken acknowledgement of the attention they had both been feeling but neither had named. As the minutes passed, Ethan became acutely aware of the small details, the way the sunlight caught in Marissa's hair, the subtle shift of her posture as she leaned slightly closer, the almost imperceptible warmth radiating from her presence. It was confusing. He knew the boundaries, the rules, the social norms that dictated their interactions, and yet, he felt a pull he could not explain. His mind raced, wondering if she was aware of it too, if perhaps she felt the same tension that made his chest tighten and his thoughts scatter. Marissa seemed to notice his distraction. "You're quiet today," she said, her voice gentle but probing. Ethan hesitated, searching for words. He wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the silence, yet he felt the weight of propriety holding him back. "Just thinking," he managed to reply, and she gave a small, knowing smile. It wasn't mocking, it was a smile that suggested understanding, as though she acknowledged the unspoken without needing to give it a name. The room felt smaller now, the walls drawing closer, the space between them charged with an energy that was both thrilling and terrifying. Ethan's thoughts kept drifting, imagining what it would be like if this attention were reciprocated, if the unspoken could somehow be explored. He quickly shook the thought away, reminding himself that this was wrong, that boundaries existed for a reason. And yet, his gaze kept returning to her, drawn despite his better judgment. For her part, Marissa remained composed, though her mind was equally restless. She had seen many students come and go, yet Ethan stirred something she had not expected. There was a connection, subtle and fleeting, that made her pulse quicken and her thoughts wander into dangerous territory. She reminded herself of her life outside the classroom, of the vows she had taken, and yet, in this quiet, empty room, she allowed herself a moment of indulgence, a fleeting glance, a hint of warmth, a shared breath that neither of them would name aloud. Time seemed suspended, stretching with every passing second. The usual classroom sounds, the scraping of chairs, distant footsteps, the hum of fluorescent lights, were gone, leaving only the two of them, cocooned in an almost tangible tension. Ethan felt a strange combination of anticipation and guilt, and he noticed Marissa's careful restraint mirrored his own inner struggle. Neither spoke of it, yet the electricity in the air said more than words ever could. Eventually, the moment began to fade. Ethan realized how long he had been sitting, how still he had become, and felt a sudden rush of awareness. He needed to leave, to break the spell that had been woven in the silence of the classroom. He stood, awkwardly gathering his things, and Marissa's eyes followed him as he moved. "Thank you for staying a moment," she said, her voice carrying that same subtle warmth, a hint of something unspoken that lingered even as he turned toward the door. As Ethan walked out, he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would be the same again. That single moment, brief and unremarkable to an outside observer, had shifted something between them. Both of them carried a secret awareness, a spark that neither dared to name, yet both could feel the weight of it pressing just beneath the surface. It was a beginning, delicate, dangerous, and electric, and it marked the first chapter of a story neither had expected to unfold. The day after that quiet encounter, Ethan found himself thinking about the classroom long after he had left. Every time he walked past the building, he felt an odd pull, a mixture of curiosity and unease. He couldn't explain why the memory of Marissa's gaze lingered so strongly in his mind, or why the smallest detail, the way she had leaned slightly toward him, the warmth in her voice, kept replaying like a scene from a dream. He tried to focus on his assignments, on the normal rhythm of student life, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. Marissa, too, felt the echo of that moment. She found herself glancing at the empty classroom long after Ethan had left, recalling the brief proximity, the quiet intensity of their interaction. She told herself it was harmless, nothing more than the fleeting connection that sometimes passed between teacher and student, yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. Each time she thought about it, she reminded herself of her husband, of the life she had built outside the classroom, and yet, a flicker of curiosity, a spark of temptation, refused to be dismissed. A week passed, and the rhythm of their interactions began to change subtly. Ethan stayed behind more often, ostensibly to ask questions about coursework, but it became clear to both of them that there was something unspoken guiding these moments. Each time he approached her desk, he noticed her eyes following him with a keen attention, as though measuring his every movement. She, in turn, noticed the way he hesitated before speaking, the way he fidgeted with his notebook, the subtle tension in his posture. It was a dance neither had rehearsed but both participated in, and it made the air between them charged. One afternoon, after the last student had left, Ethan found himself alone in the classroom again. The familiar quiet settled around them like a blanket, yet there was a new awareness in the space, a tension that made every small gesture feel magnified. Marissa gestured toward a chair near her desk. "Please, sit," she said, her voice softer than usual, tinged with something that made Ethan's chest tighten. He obeyed, moving forward with a careful deliberation, aware of the silence that had wrapped itself around them. They spoke at first about his recent assignments, discussing details of essays and projects, but even in the mundane, there was a subtle electricity. Every glance, every brief pause, seemed loaded with meaning. Ethan noticed the slight shift of her hand when she leaned over a paper, the way her eyes lingered on him just a fraction longer than necessary. His own heart raced, caught between curiosity, guilt, and the strange thrill of being noticed so completely. Marissa, for her part, tried to focus on the work. She had taught for years and handled many students, yet Ethan's presence stirred something she wasn't prepared for. There was an undeniable attraction, though neither of them had acknowledged it aloud, and it made her feel alive in a way that her orderly life outside the classroom rarely did. She caught herself imagining what it would be like if these fleeting moments were allowed to grow, and quickly chastised herself for the thought. As the discussion went on, Ethan found himself speaking more openly than he ever had with her before. He talked about the challenges of balancing schoolwork with part-time jobs, the loneliness that sometimes came with being far from home, and the subtle pressures of trying to succeed in a world that often felt indifferent. Marissa listened with an intensity that made him feel seen in a way that was rare, almost intoxicating. Each nod, each encouraging word, seemed to draw him closer, both emotionally and mentally. Even as he reminded himself of the boundaries that existed, there were moments when the air seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. A pen accidentally brushed his hand, lingering slightly longer than necessary. She adjusted a paper closer to him, and for a heartbeat, their fingers almost touched. Neither pulled away immediately, both aware of the subtle thrill, the dangerous excitement of proximity. It was a careful balance. They were aware of the line between them, yet the human pull of curiosity and attraction made it increasingly difficult to maintain distance. At one point, Ethan looked up and caught Marissa's gaze. She held his eyes with a mixture of curiosity and something unspoken, and he felt a strange vulnerability. He wanted to ask her about the flicker he saw in her eyes, to name the tension that had been growing, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded, feeling both exposed and exhilarated, aware that each passing moment in this empty classroom was weaving a connection neither had admitted aloud. Marissa broke the silence with a soft sigh, almost imperceptible. "You've grown so much this semester," she said, carefully, avoiding words that might betray the undercurrent of their interactions. "I can see how hard you've been working." Her tone was professional on the surface, but layered beneath was a warmth that made Ethan's pulse quicken. He thanked her quietly, and in that simple exchange, the weight of their unspoken connection hung in the room like a tangible presence. Time seemed to slow as they remained in the quiet classroom. The usual sounds of bustling students and hallway chatter were absent, leaving them cocooned in a space that felt private, intimate, yet safe in its ambiguity. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, curiosity, guilt, excitement, and a longing to understand what this meant. Marissa's mind mirrored his in complexity, torn between the thrill of attention and the boundaries she knew she could not cross. Eventually, the moment drew to a close, though neither wanted it to end. Ethan stood, carefully gathering his things, aware of the lingering tension that followed him as he prepared to leave. Marissa's gaze tracked him to the door, holding on a fraction longer than necessary. "Take care, Ethan," she said, her voice gentle, almost personal. He nodded, words failing him, and stepped out into the hallway, feeling the weight of what had just passed. As he walked away, the memory of her gaze stayed with him, embedding itself in his mind. The day felt heavier, more vivid, as though the empty classroom had transformed into a stage for something larger than either of them had anticipated. Both knew that the moments alone had shifted something subtly but irrevocably. It wasn't a romance, it wasn't a confession, and it certainly wasn't an act of betrayal, yet it carried the tension of possibility, a delicate line between restraint and desire that neither could ignore. By the time Ethan reached the courtyard, he was aware that nothing would feel the same again. Every glance, every word, and every touch, even the briefest, had marked the beginning of something far more complex than either of them could yet define. The connection lingered in the quiet corners of his mind, pulling at him, teasing the edges of propriety, and leaving a promise of tension, curiosity, and emotion that would continue to grow in the chapters to come. The days after the rainstorm carried with them a quiet restlessness that Daniel could not shake. He woke earlier than usual, sometimes finding himself sitting by the window as if waiting for the sound of Evelyn's bicycle. He told himself it was harmless curiosity, a distraction from the monotony of his life, yet he knew the truth went deeper. Clara remained kind, attentive in her own way, but she seemed absorbed by the routines of cooking, cleaning, and managing the house. Whenever Daniel tried to focus on her words, his mind would drift back to Evelyn's voice, light and effortless, echoing in the corners of his memory. When Evelyn finally returned, the weather was bright, and her smile seemed brighter still. She greeted him warmly, surprised perhaps to see him at the door instead of Clara. Daniel felt a nervous energy in his chest as he returned the bottles. They spoke longer than usual, about trivial things, the changing leaves, the upcoming holidays, the long routes she had to take through neighboring towns. Daniel listened with an intensity that startled even himself, and Evelyn seemed to notice. Her laughter lingered as she rode away, and Daniel stood at the gate for a long time after, watching her disappear from sight. That evening, Clara remarked on his mood. "You seem distracted lately," she said, her voice soft but tinged with concern. "Work," Daniel answered too quickly. "Just work." She nodded, accepting the excuse, though her eyes studied him for a moment longer than usual. As days turned into weeks, those short encounters with Evelyn became more than chance meetings. Daniel began to look forward to them with a quiet intensity, timing his mornings so he could step outside at the right moment. Evelyn, for her part, seemed willing to linger, no longer rushing away after handing over the bottles. They shared stories, some funny, some personal. She told him about her childhood in a small town, about her love for painting when she found the time, and about the way she admired people who seemed settled in their lives. Daniel found himself confessing more than he intended, his frustrations with work, his struggles with Clara's quiet distance, his longing for something he couldn't quite name. Evelyn listened without judgment, her eyes warm, her responses filled with empathy. There was no plan in their closeness, no clear intention, yet with each passing day, the line between casual talk and something deeper began to blur. One afternoon, a sudden storm forced Evelyn to take shelter again. Clara was away at her sister's, leaving Daniel alone in the house. Evelyn hesitated on the porch, glancing at the darkening clouds, and Daniel, without thinking too long, invited her inside. She accepted, setting her satchel on the floor and brushing raindrops from her hair. The house felt different with her presence, as though the walls themselves had shifted. They sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea while the storm rattled the windows. Their conversation flowed easily, laughter breaking through the sound of thunder outside. Daniel watched the way her eyes lit up when she spoke, the way her hands moved with every story. Then came a pause, a silence that stretched just a little too long. Evelyn's gaze lingered on him, and Daniel felt the weight of it. His heart beat faster, the air charged with something unspoken. He wanted to step back, to remind himself of his vows, of Clara, of the life he had built. Yet at the same time, he felt drawn toward Evelyn in a way he had never anticipated. She lowered her eyes, as though realizing the danger of the moment, and let out a quiet laugh to break the tension. "This storm will pass soon," she said softly. Daniel nodded, though his thoughts raced. He wanted to say something, anything, to explain what he was feeling, but words failed him. Instead, he busied himself with pouring more tea, pretending not to notice the flush in his own cheeks. The hours passed, and when the rain finally eased, Evelyn stood reluctantly. "I should go," she said. Her voice carried a note of hesitation, as if leaving felt harder than it should. Daniel walked her to the door. For a moment, they stood there, neither moving. Then, almost instinctively, she reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. It was the lightest of touches, fleeting, but enough to ignite something deep inside him. Evelyn quickly withdrew, offering a small smile. "Thank you for the tea," she said before stepping out into the damp air. Daniel closed the door slowly, his chest tight. He leaned against the wood, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He knew he was treading dangerous ground, yet part of him longed for the risk, for the spark Evelyn had awakened. In the days that followed, the memory of that touch haunted him. He replayed the moment endlessly, wondering if it had meant as much to her as it had to him. His conversations with Clara grew shorter, his excuses more frequent. She noticed, of course. One evening, as they sat in silence after dinner, she finally spoke. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm but firm, "are you hiding something from me?" The question struck him like a stone. He shook his head quickly, forcing a reassuring smile. "No, Clara. Of course not." But the doubt lingered in her eyes, and Daniel felt the first crack widening between them. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued to arrive, her presence as captivating as ever. Their conversations grew softer, more personal, filled with pauses heavy with unspoken feelings. They never said what lingered in the air between them, but each glance, each smile, each hesitation carried more weight than words ever could. One evening, Daniel found himself waiting by the gate long before she was due. When Evelyn finally appeared, the setting sun cast a golden glow around her. She slowed as she reached him, her expression gentle, almost knowing. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Evelyn said quietly, "We should be careful." Daniel nodded, though his heart ached at the truth in her words. Careful. It was a warning, a reminder of the boundaries they were both skirting. Yet even as he agreed, he knew that carefulness was already slipping away, replaced by a desire neither of them dared to name. As she rode off, Daniel remained at the gate, the evening air cool against his skin. He told himself again and again that it was harmless, that nothing had truly happened. But deep inside, he knew that the storm was no longer outside his house, it was inside him, growing stronger with